lights of Novorossiysk reflected off the water in long, trembling ribbons. 43 tankers at anchor, $3 billion of crude oil waiting for its next voyage. The Sheskharis terminal glowing behind the breakwater like something permanent and untouchable. Russian Naval Command had spent years making it that way. And in the darkness beyond the breakwater, 8 autonomous naval drones were running silent at 4 knots, 40 centimeters below the surface chop, on a course that every Russian naval planner had declared mathematically impossible. They were wrong. I'm your host at ConflictEast, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What you're about to hear is the story of one of the most audacious maritime strikes of the entire conflict. A GUR operation that didn't just hit a target, it dismantled a strategic assumption the Russian Navy had built its entire Black Sea defense posture around. The assumption was this: Novorossiysk cannot be reached by Ukrainian naval drones. The harbor sits behind a massive reinforced concrete breakwater. Ka-27 helicopters patrol the outer approaches on rotating 6-hour cycles. Acoustic barrier arrays were installed beneath the surface to detect the distinctive cavitation signatures of incoming drone craft. The shore-based ISR cell at the Naval Command building on Seams Bay runs 24-hour surveillance radar coverage of every approach vector. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, battered and reduced after successive Ukrainian maritime strikes, had concentrated whatever remained of its serious naval infrastructure here, at this port, and wrapped it in the most comprehensive defensive network it could construct. The Sheskharis petroleum terminal is why. Sheskharis is not just a fuel export facility. It is the single largest crude oil export node still functioning for Russian energy revenue. After Ukrainian long-range strikes disrupted Baltic pipeline transit and forced insurance rates on Russian cargo vessels into commercially unviable territory, Sheskharis became the choke point through which Russian petroleum wealth flowed to international markets. Novorossiysk became, in essence, Russia's economic jugular, which made it the most logical target in the entire conflict, and also, Russian command believed, the most protected. To understand what GUR's Maritime Operations Directorate planned, you have to understand the geography of Novorossiysk harbor. The main channel through the breakwater faces northeast, into prevailing wind patterns that create a predictable surface chop of between 40 and 80 centimeters during typical overnight hours. The outer anchorage, where the tanker queue positions, sits in a natural bowl partially sheltered by the Caucasus foothills to the east. The Ka-27 patrol helicopters fly standard racetracks covering the open Black Sea approaches, the obvious vectors. The acoustic arrays were installed along the primary deep water approach lanes. But there is a secondary vector. A shallow draft lane running along the inner coastline, used by small commercial traffic and fishing vessels, that threads inside the acoustic array perimeter before intersecting the outer breakwater. It was never a serious attack concern because it required navigating roughly 12 kilometers of coastal shallows at depths between 2 and 4 meters, threading through a cluster of moored fishing vessels near the village of Abrau-Djurso, and then making a final approach in the shadow of the breakwater itself, all while avoiding the rotational sweep of 3 separate radar emitters. GUR's planning cell studied this lane for 4 months. What they found was an obstacle that looked insurmountable but contained one exploitable seam. The shore-based ISR cell that provides the radar picture for the harbor defense system operates on a handoff cycle. The day crew, running the highest resolution tracking software, ends its shift. The night crew takes over. During that handoff, a window of approximately 18 minutes while both crews are in transition, running system checks, the outgoing crew briefing the incoming team. The radar picture is being reviewed by people who are distracted, logging out, and logging in. 18 minutes. That is the seam. Which weapon do you think posed the greater threat to Russia's naval infrastructure at Novorossiysk? A. HIMARS precision strikes from land. B. Storm Shadow cruise missiles from Ukrainian aircraft. C. Sea Baby maritime drones navigating the coastal approach. Drop your answer in the comments. The answer may surprise you. The Sea Baby drone program emerged from Ukraine's broader autonomous weapons initiative in the earlier phases of the conflict. By the period of this operation, the platform had undergone significant evolution. The version deployed in this strike was operating at its 3rd-generation configuration. A fiberglass hull roughly 5.5 meters in length, displacing approximately 1 metric ton fully loaded. The propulsion system had been upgraded to a pair of electric motors driving shrouded propellers, reducing acoustic signature dramatically compared to earlier variants. Navigation ran on a hybrid system combining preloaded GPS waypoints with terrain-following sonar for shallow water obstacle avoidance and a passive optical sensor array that could recognize landmark features for position correction. The explosive payload was the critical modification. Each drone carried between 200 and 250 kilograms of combined shape, charge, and fragmentation explosive, configured in a forward-penetrating warhead design. The intent was not to sink vessels. These were not torpedo-style systems. The intent was to breach hull plating and ignite cargo. 8 drones, 2,000 kilograms of explosive. Against 43 tankers at anchor and a petroleum terminal processing 40,000 barrels per day. Stay with me, because what happens in the next sequence fundamentally changes how naval analysts understand harbor defense against autonomous maritime weapons. This isn't just a strike report. It's a case study in how Ukraine exploits predictability. The planning phase lasted 4 months. The execution phase lasted less than 3 hours. GUR's maritime cell had identified 3 categories of problem that needed to be solved simultaneously. The first problem was launch position. The Sea Baby drones needed to enter the water at a point that placed them on the coastal shallow draft vector without crossing the acoustic array perimeter before they could reach minimum detection depth. Satellite analysis of fishing vessel traffic patterns identified a small cove near Abrau-Dyrso where local boats habitually anchored overnight. This created natural radar clutter. Intermittent surface contacts that harbor radar operators had learned to filter as non-threatening. A maritime insertion team operating from a converted civilian vessel positioned the launch platform within this clutter zone, using the fishing vessel signatures as masking. The second problem was the Ka-27 helicopters. Their patrol schedule was not unknown to Ukrainian intelligence. OSINT analysis of flight tracking data, intercepted radio transmissions, and human intelligence assets operating in the port city had reconstructed the rotation cycle with high confidence. The helicopters flew 2 ship pairs on alternating 6-hour tracks. Shift change for the helicopter crews corresponded, not by accident, with a period of reduced patrol density as aircraft returned for crew rotation and refueling. This reduced overflight coverage by roughly 40% during the transition period. The third problem was timing the strike to coincide with both the ISR cell handoff and the helicopter rotation minimum. Those 2 windows did not naturally overlap. The ISR handoff happened at a fixed time. The helicopter rotation happened at a different fixed time. The gap between them was approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes. 2 hours and 40 minutes was exactly how long it took the Sea Baby drones to navigate the coastal shallow draft lane from the launch position to the inner breakwater approach at 4 knots. The synchronization was not a coincidence. GUR's planning cell had worked backward from the ISR handoff window, calculated the required transit time, and identified the helicopter rotation minimum that preceded it by the necessary margin. The launch time was set to place the drones at the inner breakwater at the precise moment the ISR handoff was underway and helicopter coverage was at its minimum. How many tankers did the Sea Baby strike package reach before Russian defensive systems engaged? A 4B6C9. Hold that number in your mind. The answer comes at the end, and it changes everything about how you'll think about harbor defense. Here is the complication no one planned for. 3 hours before the planned launch, one of the 8 drones developed a navigation system fault. The onboard position correction software flagged a calibration error in the passive optical sensor array, the system used for landmark recognition and position correction in the shallow water transit. Without it, the drone could follow its preloaded GPS waypoints but could not perform the precision terminal guidance needed to thread the inner breakwater gap. In the shallow approach lane, a navigation error of more than 8 meters would ground the drone on the mud-flat shelf running along the northern edge of the channel. The mission controller had 40 minutes to make a decision. The options were: abort the affected drone and launch with 7, recalibrate the sensor array manually, a process that required physical access to the drone and could not be completed in the available window, or accept degraded navigation on that drone and attempt the transit at reduced speed with manual remote correction through the encrypted data link. The decision was to launch 7 drones on full autonomous profile and hold the 8th in reserve, to be launched manually via data link with a human operator providing real-time navigation corrections through the shallow section. This added a human operator to the mission profile who would need to maintain encrypted communications with the 8th drone throughout its 2-hour 40-minute transit. Every minute of that data link represented a potential emission signature that Russian signals intelligence could detect. The operator accepted the risk. 7 drones slid beneath the surface of the cove at the designated launch time, already running on their autonomous profiles. The 8th drone entered the water 30 seconds later, its operator 200 kilometers away in a hardened communications facility, watching a blurred sonar feed and navigating by feel. Subscribe to ConflictEast if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happens in those 3 hours of silent transit is what separates doctrine from reality. The 7 autonomous drones navigated the coastal lane exactly as planned. The Abrau-Dyrso fishing vessel cluster masked their surface disturbance as they crossed the first radar shadow zone. At 4 knots, they covered the shallow water section in approximately 90 minutes, running at maximum acoustic suppression. Motors at 60% power, propellers turning at reduced cavitation threshold. Sonar returns from the harbor floor showed depths averaging 3.2 meters. The drones ran at 40 centimeters below the surface, leaving minimal wake signature in the overnight chop. Drone 7, the manually operated unit, fell behind by 11 minutes in the shallow section. The operator, watching degraded navigation data and making micro-corrections through the encrypted link, was threading a 5-meter craft through a lane where the safe corridor narrowed to roughly 15 meters at its tightest point. The mud shelf on the northern edge was invisible to the drone's sensors, but present in the pre-mission chart data, the operator was cross-referencing against the sonar feed. At one point, Drone 7's sonar showed a depth reading of 1.8 meters directly ahead. The operator had 3 seconds to decide. He turned the drone 9 degrees to port on manual control, holding the adjustment for 11 seconds, then brought it back to course. The depth reading cleared to 2.7 meters. The drone continued. Russian shore radar was painting the approaches in its standard sweep pattern. The ISR cell was 40 minutes from handoff. The Ka-27 helicopters were 90 minutes from their rotation minimum. The autonomous drones reached the inner breakwater shadow zone at the calculated time. The manually operated drone arrived 14 minutes later, having lost time in the shallow section but successfully navigated the critical choke point. 8 drones, all functional, all inside the breakwater perimeter. If you believe that preparation defeats improvisation, that the side which plans harder wins even when things go wrong, type ConflictEast in the comments, because what comes next is exactly that principle in action. The transition from transit mode to attack mode happens automatically in the autonomous drones at a pre-programmed waypoint. At a designated GPS coordinate inside the inner harbor, each drone's mission profile shifts from low-profile navigation to terminal approach. Motors go to maximum power, propeller speed increases, depth rises to surface running configuration. The drones are no longer trying to be invisible. They are trying to cover the remaining distance to target as fast as possible before defensive systems can respond. The Sea Baby's maximum surface speed in terminal approach configuration is approximately 80 kilometers per hour. From the transition waypoint to the tanker anchorage was approximately 2 kilometers, 98 seconds. The ISR handoff was in progress. The outgoing radar operator was explaining a contact track on the outer approaches, a legitimate civilian cargo vessel that had altered course unexpectedly 20 minutes earlier and required documentation. The incoming operator was logging in, headset on, coffee cup in hand. The harbor radar painted 8 simultaneous surface contacts emerging from the inner breakwater shadow at high speed. The outgoing operator looked at the screen. The incoming operator looked at the screen. The outgoing operator keyed his radio. What would NATO's harbor defense doctrine have done differently in those 98 seconds? Comment your tactical analysis. Because the answer has fundamentally reshaped how Western naval planners think about port security. By the time the first defensive radio call went out, the lead drones were 60 seconds from the tanker anchorage. Russian Naval Command had planned for this scenario in a theoretical sense. There were anti-drone patrol boats assigned to the harbor. There was a point defense cannon mounted on the breakwater. There was a rapid response protocol that designated which patrol vessel would respond to a harbor penetration alert. The protocol required the patrol vessel commander to receive authorization from the duty officer before engaging. The duty officer was on the telephone with the ISR cell trying to understand what he was looking at on his situational display. The authorization never came. The lead drone, Drone 1 in GUR's mission numbering, reached its designated target at 3:17 a.m. The target was a Sovcomflot-affiliated crude carrier sitting at anchor in the main tanker queue, fully loaded, waiting for its transit slot through the Bosphorus. The drone hit below the waterline on the port side, forward of amidships, at the junction of 2 cargo tank bulkheads. The shaped charge detonated first, breaching hull plating in a roughly 4-meter diameter penetration. The fragmentation component detonated 0.003 seconds later inside the hull. The combination of hull breach, fragmentation propagation, and the cargo of crude oil under slight positive pressure from loading operations created the conditions for immediate cargo fire. The tanker burned. Drone 2 reached its target 7 seconds later. A second crude carrier at the adjacent anchorage position. Same profile, same result. Drone 3 altered its approach to the east, targeting the loading arm infrastructure at Sheskharis terminal's secondary berth. The loading arm assembly is a complex piece of equipment. Articulated steel structures roughly 12 meters tall that connect the terminal's pipeline to vessels at berth. A direct hit from a drone carrying 220 kilograms of shaped explosive does not merely damage a loading arm. It destroys the structural mounts, severs the pipeline connection, and triggers emergency shutdown protocols throughout the terminal's safety system. Pipeline pressure sensors detect the breach and close automated valves across the entire facility. Drone 3 hit the secondary berth loading arm at 3:17 a.m. and 11 seconds. The Sheskharis terminal went into emergency shutdown at 3:17 a.m. and 14 seconds. 40,000 barrels per day of crude export capacity. Stopped. Drones 4 and 5 targeted the tankers on the outer anchorage positions, the queue of vessels waiting for a berth assignment. These ships were further from the terminal, sitting in slightly more exposed positions, but they were stationary, loaded, and undefended. Drone 4 reached its target. Impact. Drone 5 reached its target. Impact. The Russian patrol boat that should have been the first line of harbor defense was still awaiting authorization when Drone 5 detonated. The patrol boat commander, watching 2 tankers burning in the main anchorage, made the decision to engage without waiting for authorization. He turned his vessel toward the remaining drone contacts and pushed his throttles to maximum. He was too late. Drone 6 was already inside the defensive perimeter established by the patrol boat's intercept course. It passed the bow of the patrol boat at a distance of roughly 30 meters and continued toward the primary Sheskharis loading arm. The main berth structure, larger and more critical than the secondary arm that Drone 3 had already destroyed. The patrol boat's bow-mounted cannon depressed to engage. It fired 4 rounds. 3 missed. The 4th struck Drone 6 aft of the navigation sensor array, damaging the autonomous guidance system. Drone 6 veered off course by approximately 12 degrees. It hit the loading arm support structure at an oblique angle instead of direct impact. The warhead still detonated. The primary loading arm sustained catastrophic structural damage. One of the 2 main support columns sheared at the base. The arm itself collapsed onto the berthed vessel's aft deck, crushing the stern superstructure of a Russian-flagged product tanker that had been preparing to depart. Drone 7, the manually operated unit, approached from a slightly different vector, having approached the transition waypoint 14 minutes behind the autonomous package. By the time Drone 7 reached terminal approach speed, harbor defenses had been fully alerted for approximately 4 minutes. The Ka-27 helicopter crew on standby at the base received their scramble order and was in the air. Additional patrol vessels were underway. The drone operator, watching his sensor feed through the encrypted link from 200 kilometers away, saw the defensive picture clearly. A patrol vessel was crossing directly across Drone 7's planned approach track. A helicopter was inbound. He made a decision in real time. He turned Drone 7 toward the fuel bunkering infrastructure on the harbor's eastern margin. A complex of storage tanks and pumping equipment that serviced vessels in the harbor and was not Drone 7's planned target. The original target was a 3rd tanker in the main anchorage queue. The fuel bunkering complex was closer, more accessible, and potentially more valuable from a denial of service standpoint. Drone 7 hit a bunkering pump station at the base of the storage tank complex at 3:21 a.m. The resulting fire took 9 hours to extinguish. Drone 8. The final unit in the package was the one Russian defenders successfully intercepted. The Ka-27 helicopter, now airborne, located the drone at surface level approximately 800 meters from the outer tanker anchorage. The helicopter's door gunner engaged with a naval machine gun, and the drone was destroyed before reaching its target. 7 of 8 drones reached their targets. 5 tankers struck. 2 terminal loading arm assemblies destroyed. 1 bunkering facility fire. 1 Bosphorus-bound crude carrier burning in the main anchorage. Ukrainian General Staff reports from the post-strike assessment described the outcome as exceeding operational parameters on 4 of 5 primary objectives. Satellite imagery analysis conducted in the hours and days following the strike confirmed the scale of the damage. Both loading arm assemblies at Sheskharis terminal's main and secondary berths were rendered non-functional. Imagery showed the collapsed primary arm still lying across the stern of the berthed tanker. Emergency containment booms had been deployed around 2 burning vessels in the main anchorage. The bunkering complex fire had consumed the pump station and partially damaged 1 adjacent storage tank, which had been manually isolated to prevent catastrophic tank farm ignition. The Sheskharis terminal ceased export operations entirely. Combat footage verification, sourced from maritime traffic monitoring services and commercial satellite operators, confirmed that no crude oil tanker departures occurred from Novorossiysk for 11 consecutive days following the strike. The queue of vessels waiting at anchor gradually dispersed to alternate ports and waiting positions further offshore. Insurers suspended coverage for Novorossiysk origin cargo. The financial impact of 11 days of zero export throughput at 40,000 barrels per day at prevailing Urals crude prices came to approximately $28 million in lost export revenue, before accounting for physical repair costs, damaged vessels, or the insurance market response. OSINT investigations revealed that intercepted communications from the Novorossiysk Harbor Command in the hours after the strike showed a command structure in near-total situational confusion. The duty officer who had delayed authorization for the patrol boat response was relieved of command within 48 hours. Russian Naval Command launched an immediate investigation into the acoustic barrier system. How had 8 drones transited the coastal lane without triggering a single detection alarm? The answer was operationally straightforward. The acoustic barriers had been installed along the primary deep water approach lanes, the vectors that any conventional naval attack would use. The coastal shallow draft lane had been assessed as impassable for attack craft and therefore received no acoustic barrier coverage. Russian planners had allowed their defensive investment to be guided by their own assumptions about what was possible. Ukraine planned its attack around those same assumptions, not to confirm them, but to exploit the gap they created. Here's the tactical question that every naval officer in every Allied Navy was asking in the weeks after the strike. Did Russian command make an error by concentrating their defensive infrastructure around the deep water approaches? Or was the shallow draft lane simply too difficult to defend cost-effectively, making the acoustic barrier gap a reasonable resource allocation decision? Think about that. It's not an obvious answer. Comment what you think. This is exactly the kind of doctrinal question that ConflictEast exists to analyze. The Sheskharis strike generated analysis at every level of Western naval and maritime security thinking. The most fundamental lesson was about choke points. Novorossiysk had become indispensable to Russian energy export logistics precisely because it was the last fully functional major export terminal available to the Russian crude market. That indispensability meant Russia had to defend it. But defending it required concentrating defensive resources around the infrastructure, which meant concentrating that infrastructure in one place, which meant a successful strike produced maximum strategic disruption. The same logic that made Novorossiysk worth defending made it worth attacking. The second lesson was about autonomous systems and the mathematics of harbor defense. A patrol boat can intercept one drone. A helicopter can intercept one drone. A point defense cannon can engage one target at a time. When 8 drones attack simultaneously from multiple vectors, any defense built around intercepting individual threats is outnumbered from the moment the attack begins. The only effective defense against a coordinated autonomous swarm is either detection at sufficient range to vector intercept forces before the swarm reaches terminal approach speed, or a networked point defense system capable of engaging multiple simultaneous targets. Russia had neither at Novorossiysk. Western naval analysts noted, quietly, in classified assessment documents subsequently referenced in open-source reporting, that most NATO harbor facilities faced a structurally similar problem. Point defense systems built around single-threat scenarios. Radar networks with handoff procedures that created predictable vulnerability windows. Acoustic detection systems installed along assessed threat vectors rather than comprehensive coverage. The Sea Baby attack on Novorossiysk was not just a Ukrainian strike. It was a demonstration that changed how every navy thinks about harbor defense. The third lesson was about the ISR handoff vulnerability. This was not a new concept in intelligence tradecraft. The shift-change vulnerability is known and documented. What made the Novorossiysk operation notable was the precision of the exploitation. GUR's planning cell had spent 4 months characterizing not just the existence of the handoff window, but its exact duration, its impact on defensive response capability, and the correlation between the handoff timing and the helicopter rotation cycle. The synchronization required to place 8 drones at the transition point during that specific window demonstrated a level of pre-mission intelligence work that operational planners across multiple militaries recognized as genuinely sophisticated. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. It identifies windows its adversaries have assumed were too narrow to matter. The fourth lesson was about the manually operated drone, Unit 7, and the real-time targeting decision made by the operator when defensive conditions changed. The operator had been assigned a specific target. When the defensive picture made that target inaccessible, he redirected to the bunkering facility. That decision was made in real time, under stress, by a human operator 200 kilometers from the engagement zone. And it worked. The bunkering facility fire caused strategic disruption that lasted longer than any of the tanker strikes. Flexibility in terminal execution. The ability to redirect an asset to a secondary target when primary conditions change requires training, judgment, and communication infrastructure. GUR's maritime operation demonstrated all 3. Now, about your answer to the quiz from earlier in the video. The question was, how many tankers did the Sea Baby strike package reach before Russian defensive systems engaged? The answer is 6. 6 of the 8 drones reached their designated or redirected targets before any effective Russian defensive response was achieved. Drone 6 was engaged by the patrol boat cannon and deflected, but still reached its target in degraded form. Drone 7 was redirected by its operator to the bunkering facility. Drone 8 was destroyed by the Ka-27 helicopter before reaching its target. If you answered 6, you understood the operational geometry of this strike. If you answered 4 or 9, here's why those numbers were plausible but incorrect. 4 represents the number of tankers struck directly in the main anchorage, the core of the original plan. 9 would have been the total if the strike package had included a 9th drone that some early assessments speculated was part of the launch. The actual deployed package was 8, with 7 reaching their objectives. The number 6 matters because it tells you how long it took Russian harbor defense to mount any effective response to a mass simultaneous autonomous attack in their most protected port. Approximately 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, the strategic picture of Novorossiysk harbor changed permanently. Ever heard a naval defense planner say their harbor was impregnable? Think about that word. Impregnable. Every harbor ever called impregnable has eventually been penetrated by someone who studied it long enough and creatively enough to see the gap that the defenders had stopped seeing because they built their confidence around it. The Russian Navy built its confidence around Novorossiysk. They built layered defenses. They built acoustic barriers. They built patrol schedules. They built shift handoff procedures. They built predictability. And GUR spent 4 months studying that predictability until they could write their own operational plan around the gaps it created. Will Russia be able to restore Sheskharis terminal to full export capacity within 6 months of this strike? Comment yes or no. Because the structural damage to both loading arm assemblies, combined with the international marine insurance response, creates a timeline problem that isn't just about welding steel back together. Real tactics, real consequences. ConflictEast. In the days that followed the strike, the Russian response operated on 2 tracks simultaneously. The first track was defensive remediation. Russian Naval Command ordered immediate installation of additional acoustic detection equipment in the coastal shallow draft lanes surrounding Novorossiysk. Additional patrol vessels were assigned to harbor security duties. The Ka-27 helicopter rotation cycle was modified to reduce the overlap period during crew changes. An emergency review of harbor defense protocols was initiated, and the authorization requirement for patrol vessel engagement was modified to allow immediate engagement of unidentified contacts during heightened threat conditions. Whether these changes hold against a future attack depends on whether GUR develops approaches that exploit the modified defensive posture rather than the old one. Based on the operational history of Ukraine's maritime drone campaign, that adaptation cycle has historically favored the attacker. The second track was damage assessment and repair. Russian engineering teams began work immediately on the Sheskharis loading arm infrastructure. Early estimates from Russian commercial shipping sources suggested repair timelines of 4 to 8 weeks for minimum operational capacity restoration. Full restoration to pre-strike export throughput was assessed at significantly longer. Those estimates proved optimistic. The complexity of replacing a 12-meter articulated loading arm assembly in a facility being simultaneously assessed by international marine insurers who had suspended coverage for cargo loading at the terminal, while also managing the reputational impact of the strike on tanker operator willingness to berth at Novorossiysk, created a compounding problem that engineering teams could not solve with welders and cranes alone. Export throughput from Novorossiysk in the 30 days following the strike was reduced by approximately 60% compared to the 30 days preceding it. That reduction was not due solely to physical damage. It came from the combination of physical damage and the behavioral response of tanker operators and insurers who had updated their risk assessment of the port. That behavioral effect is something military planners sometimes underestimate. A strike does not only damage what it hits, it changes what the market around the target is willing to do. When tanker operators, commercial entities operating on commercial logic, decide that the risk premium for loading at Novorossiysk is no longer acceptable relative to alternate routing options, Russian export capacity drops even without additional physical strikes. The GUR operation achieved physical damage that would have been valuable on its own. It also achieved behavioral disruption that multiplied the strategic effect. The Sheskharis terminal, the tanker queue, the bunkering facility burning for 9 hours, the loading arms down, the helicopter that arrived 4 minutes too late, the duty officer who waited too long for authorization. These are the mechanics of how a navy that no longer has ships sinks an economy. Ukraine has lost its naval fleet in any conventional sense. What it has built instead is something different. A maritime capability based on autonomous systems, precise intelligence, and the willingness to study an adversary's defensive assumptions until it can write its own operational plan around the gaps those assumptions create. Was concentrating Russian crude export capacity at Novorossiysk an unavoidable strategic necessity or a fundamental planning error? Could Russian Naval Command have designed a defense genuinely resistant to this approach? Or was the shallow draft lane always an exploitable gap regardless of how much money Russia spent on its defenses? And if you were the GUR maritime planning chief, with the post-strike intelligence picture now clear, what would your next objective be? Subscribe to ConflictEast. Because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Black Sea is quieter now than it was that night. The loading arms are being rebuilt. The burned tanker has been towed to a repair yard. The bunkering facility fire is out. The harbor looks, from the outside, like something returning to normal. But the acoustic barriers are being extended. The patrol schedules have been changed. And somewhere in a hardened communications facility, a planning team is studying the new defensive posture the way the last planning team studied the old one. The harbor is defended by its next assumptions. And assumptions, in this war, have a measurable lifespan. Real tactics, real consequences. ConflictEast.